As you all know, the subject of our evening is fundamentalism against human rights. Over the last several years, we have witnessed the strengthening of so-called neo-conservative and Christian fundamentalist groups, which have begun to operate in the form of civil society organization in Europe. The trend which dominated in the United States in the last century has made its way to Europe. Now we have some 500 groups, if I'm correct, civil society groups, institutes, associations operating in Europe, including, of course, Croatia. Who are these groups on European level? How are they connected? And what are their connections with the Catholic and Orthodox Church? We asked Neil Datta, researcher and the Secretary of European Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development. EPF is a network of parliamentarians from across Europe who are committed to improve women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Neil will give us introduction, and then later we'll have a question and answer, so you'll be able to ask questions if you want. So Neil, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for being here on your free time during the evening. And I'd also just like to start out by thanking the organizers of this event, Faktograf, HND, Gong, and the Center for Peace Studies. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'll just say a few words about my organization and why it is that we're involved in this. As was mentioned, I'm the Secretary of EPF, the European Parliamentary Forum on Population and Development. We are an organization that works on sexual and reproductive health and rights. That means we work on family planning, contraception, the right to abortion, sexual rights. And as you know, sometimes these can be a little bit controversial. And as was mentioned, there's been an increase in what here I've heard called neo-conservative. I call anti-choice or anti-human rights. It's mainly the same thing. We've seen that there's been an increase in that type of activity across the European continent over the past couple of years. And usually when these initiatives gain a certain level of success, they inevitably make it to parliament or to political level. And in which case, then usually we're contacted, being asked about what is this about? What is this anti-sexuality education measure? What is this anti-abortion measure? And what we've seen is gradually that it's a number of the same actors that are involved in these countries, involved in these initiatives across several countries. So our involvement in this has sort of happened organically. It's not something that we were aspiring to, but simply it's the byproduct of a trend that's been happening in Europe. And so what has developed over the past couple of years is an increasing attempt for us to study these, to see about connecting the dots and what patterns emerge. So that's a bit our perspective on this. Personally, I've been involved in sexual reproductive health and rights since 1999, so for a long time, almost 2 decades now. What I've seen myself is that there's been a gradual increase in anti-choice, or as you say, neo-conservative initiatives and groups over the past couple of years, especially since the year 2010. And now, basically assuming that they have the same constraints that we all do. We all have to pay competitive salaries, we all have to pay rents on our office space. If we base ourselves on that assumption, we can see that means that there's been a distinct increase in funding for an anti-choice neo-conservative infrastructure across Europe. And we see this happening at several levels, at national level and also at European level. At national level, we've seen new organizations appear in what we thought had been relatively protected spaces, such as the secular Republic in France, where all of a sudden, in the matter of a few months, a homophobic movement called La Manif pour tous appeared, and from there has been able to ensure its own sustainability and has transitioned from being purely homophobic to socially conservative on all issues, such as also anti-abortion, anti-women's rights, anti-contraception. We've seen also a new group emerge in Spain. We could have imagined that Spain would have been let's say in telecoms speak, would have been a mature market in that it's already a relatively religious Catholic country, not too long out of totalitarianism. Organizations were there, but new groups have emerged and have been able to increase their own market share among conservative groups to claim in order to advance a socially conservative agenda in a new manner. In Germany also we see the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, appearing and also claiming that same space. And even in progressive Scandinavia, we've seen the emergence of a new infrastructure appear in Sweden, essentially based around Sweden, in order to have an impact on the Swedish progressive perspective and the whole Scandinavian progressive perspective. At European level, we've seen the same thing. Over the past 7 years, we've seen that new anti-choice organizations have developed and established themselves in all the main centers of decision-making on the European continent. So first of all, that's naturally Brussels, where I've been in Brussels since 1994, working in this field since 1999. Back then, there were maybe 2-3 anti-choice organizations, and they were relatively modest and amateurish. Now we see that there's perhaps 10, 12 of them, and that they have professional lobbyists, and they fit in, and these lobbyists fit in with the Brussels lobbyists that you see in any organization. They're multilingual, they're relatively young, they have good, solid degrees, and they blend in with all the other Brussels lobbyists that you see. We also see that they've developed, that these anti-choice neo-conservative organizations have developed an infrastructure in Strasbourg, in Vienna, where a number of the UN agencies are located. Some of these organizations also, from their European bases, come to national levels. So you may have had the visit of some of these organizations called, for example, Alliance Defending Freedom, or another one called European Dignity Watch. So they make trips to national level on a fairly regular basis. So basically 2 trends that we've seen. One is legal, political, and organizing capacity has developed tremendously over the past decade. And then another important point to keep in mind is transnational contacts. They are very well connected across the region, and from this region across to North America, Latin America, and beyond, some also to Russia. So and that's an important point to make, so that whatever neoconservative anti-choice phenomenon one observes in Croatia or in other countries, we should know that a starting point is that they are well connected internationally. A second point I want to make is how these organizations have been able to reframe the issues that they have traditionally worked on, so that the old way of doing things in the 1980s and 90s, where they were simply against abortion and they would protest outside clinics. They've done that in the US, in France, in Britain. Some of them still do that. But the more sophisticated versions of them have developed a new narrative. And it's a narrative based on a threefold approach. This narrative is one, in favor of life. And we're all in favor of life, but by life, what they specifically mean is life from the moment of conception until natural death. And so that means that they are against abortion, certain types of contraception, and euthanasia. And euthanasia is debated in a certain number of countries in Europe. They are in favor of marriage. By marriage, we're all in favor of marriage, but by marriage, what they mean is an exclusive interpretation of marriage. Marriage is the traditional heterosexual patriarchal marriage, and only that marriage, and preferably sanctioned by a religious authority. And then finally is religious freedom. That's one of the most tricky ones, where by religious freedom, we're all in favor of religious freedom as well. What they specifically mean by religious freedom is the freedom of believers for them to derogate from certain legislation, among them equality or non-discrimination legislation. So that because I have a certain faith, I don't need to implement this, or I don't need to follow this legislation. Overall, these three things, life, family, life, marriage, and religious freedom, is part of an overall package as defined by the Vatican thinkers a number of years ago within the concept of human dignity. So human dignity now encompasses these three components, and is in a number of settings increasingly being used as an alternative to human rights. What we hear a number of politicians, and sometimes in the media, mainly politicians, saying, human rights are good, but what about human dignity? As if it's a notion that should surpass or transcend human rights. They have also developed a vocabulary to describe the progressive movement. In a number of different countries, the way that they describe the progressive movement, those working for women's rights, for access to abortion rights, for contraception, for LGBTQ rights, for equal marriage, they have been labeled the gender agenda or gender ideology. And this gender ideology was basically thought through by a certain number of thinkers related to the Holy See about 10 years ago, which describes any social innovation that is troubling to the Catholic Church. So it goes from anything to access to contraception, abortion, equal marriage for LGBT couples, but it can even include euthanasia. So we have this reframing of the narrative. Okay. A third point that we need to, a third component, so we've had the professionalization and expansion of the infrastructure, then we have the work on the substance, the reframing of the narrative. A third component that in the development of this anti-choice neo-conservative infrastructure is that now it has been able to connect with two other previously unconnected movements. Now, the religious conservatism, the anti-choice agenda, expresses a certain innovation in that this thinking was always present in religious thinking, but what had been previously a rather minority or dogmatic position, now those who express it do so in the name of the majority of the believers of that religion, and there's not really a counter voice from within religious voices to counter that. So there's that component, which is now mixing with another movement, and which is that of populism. In just about every country in Europe now, there's been growing populism for various reasons. This populism can be legitimate or at least understandable in many countries, but it exists. This populism takes on certain similar traits and has been instrumentalized by certain politicians and movements in that it is anti-supranational structures, so that the populism usually takes on either an anti-EU, anti-UN type of message, and we can see that this goes in different directions. In the UK, it went with Brexit. In France, just now with hostile positions towards the European Union, and in the United States with an anti-elite, anti-Washington establishment, the drain the swamp type of thing that we saw. Another component that it features is that a certain majority mob rule, so that the majority gets to set the rules for everyone, even if that means certain categories of people will lose their rights. And as we know in human rights, it's the protection of certain minorities which is of fundamental importance. So we have certain dismissal of this populism brings about a certain dismissal of supranational organizations and institutions, and also a dismissal of the traditional normative human rights framework that we have in international human rights. It also legitimizes a certain type of authoritarianism and illiberal democracy. And we've seen this most recently in Poland, Hungary, and there's developments in Turkey. And naturally, a certain authoritarianism coming from Russia and Moscow. Similarly, far-right movements have joined in, and such as Alternative für Deutschland, the Front National in France, which have all taken on board the normative substance of the anti-choice agenda. So we see here the anti-choice neoconservative religious agenda is being used as a significant percentage of the substance of populist movements. And so with these movements, we have populism, the authoritarianism of certain or authoritarianism of certain political parties, and then within that the religious dimension. And a fourth point that I would like to make is these issues now, with these three components coming together: populism, religious content of an anti-choice nature, and authoritarianism, now are forming together to develop a geopolitical dimension. So that this geopolitical dimension is important in that what we've seen now is that Russia has become, for example, one of the main defenders of what they call traditional values. By traditional values is meant the social values that I've described by the anti-choice movements, and Russia is the powers right now in the Kremlin are proactively using this as being a tempting and viable counteroffer to the Western liberal offer. And this can prove to be an interesting or at least tempting model for some, perhaps not countries or societies, but at least some leaders in the region where Russia may have influence, in that when certain countries or leaders or regimes or governments come under criticism by Western or supranational institutions, the Russian narrative can offer comfort, saying, no, you're being criticized for LGBT rights or women's rights. Don't worry, that's the West doing its own thing. You are a traditional society like us, like Russia. What you're doing is fine, and we won't criticize you. This can be rather tempting towards for certain countries and governments. We have also the geopolitics coming from the Vatican, which has been, as I've mentioned, an anti-gender frame, where they have a certain number of thinkers within the Vatican have conceptualized gender, not what we mean by gender and gender studies, but gender, what they mean is that any social innovation which displeases the church, and now are deploying this in different ways in different countries. At the UN also we see how this is coming together, where a geopolitical grouping has been put together at the United Nations called the Friends of the Family, composed of Russia, Qatar, etc., Belarus and a number of African countries, in order to stop the UN from advancing on progressive issues. And this plays out in a certain number of UN settings. For example, most recently at the UN Commission on Population and Development, and previously at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which took place in just March and April of this year. And it does look like your country with the new government is gradually aligning itself with this more conservative, reactionary agenda. What does this mean here within the European Union? The European Union has to speak with one voice in most international settings, including at the UN. So at the European Union, we have certain member states which are further along in the path towards having this combination of populism, religious ideology, and authoritarianism. These countries are Poland and Hungary. So when there's a requirement for unanimity on certain issues, and then certain member states are not willing to lend their support, this means that the EU is effectively blocked by a minority of member states. And it looks like Croatia is gradually joining in this direction. So that's a broad view about what's been happening in terms of anti-choice, neoconservative movements around Europe. I've kept it quite general for the time being and refrained from going into specific actors, but we can do that in the next phase. But maybe just some parting thoughts about what all of this means. The situation I've just described looks a little bit bleak or grim, but we need to see this in a broader historical perspective. These groups are organizing essentially because the progressives have made advances. They've made significant advances over the past 2 decades, and with these advances, this is provoking a counter-reaction. And so this is what we're witnessing now. So one thing to keep in mind also is that in order to make advances, it's not just us making our point anymore in order to explain what we're doing. We have to make our point, but anticipate that there will be a counter-reaction to that will try to undo what we've just accomplished. What we're also working on in terms of progressive reproductive health, sexual reproductive health issues, is no longer a situation simply about individual people or human rights. It also now has a geopolitical dimension, so that it is being instrumentalized by certain state actors as being a marker as to which type of coalition or party or which side you're on. And finally, we need to continue being proactive as to what it is that we're asking for. And one lesson that in terms of being proactive is that whatever gains we think we have made, those gains are not necessarily irreversible. Setbacks can happen, and if there's no better example than what just happened recently in the Russian Federation with the depenalization, the decriminalization of gender-based violence, if it can go in that direction, then that's very worrying. And so we need to keep fighting in order to go ahead.
Okay, I'll start with questions, and then if you have some, we can interrupt and we can take your questions too. Maybe just to follow up on what you were saying, it seems that they don't have any problems in cooperation, Vatican with Orthodox Church and then altogether with Muslim countries. Can you elaborate a bit on that? And is there any proofs that Russians are financing some groups in mainly Catholic states or vice versa? Can you tell us something about this cooperation and also this geopolitical part of it, especially in UN Council right now in Geneva?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so we have to, first, in terms of the Vatican, and the Holy See, we have to see this as, one, it is a state, and the positions of the Holy See as a state are anti-choice in favor of their own social teachings. And they do defend this at the level of the United Nations very strongly. Separately, the Holy See is also a religion with a religious hierarchy and infrastructure. And so what we see is different actors within the religious hierarchy behaving differently. And this religious hierarchy is not monolithic. Some cardinals, bishops, will be openly in favor of anti-choice neo-conservative organizations and will lend them their patronage. Others will not do so. So there's a diversity there within the Catholic religious hierarchy. We see a rapprochement between the Catholic and the Russian Orthodox hierarchies. It was only last year where there was this historic meeting of the Pope with Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church that took place in Cuba. It was about a year ago. And as you know, in this region, the schism took place about 1,000 years ago between the Catholics and the Orthodox. And this was the first time that these religious hierarchies were meeting in almost 1,000 years. If you take a look at what they agreed on in their joint communique, they agreed on anti-choice positions. So after not seeing each other for 1,000 years, basically they decide to discuss us and sexual reproductive health, and they agree that they're against that. In terms of the Russian Orthodox Church, what we see is that the Kremlin has been using the Russian Orthodox Church to legitimize its own power, and in return, the Kremlin pivots towards anti-choice, socially conservative values, which then legitimates the Russian Orthodox Church. And then finally, in terms of Russian actors, what we have seen is that there's a certain number of individuals who happen to be oligarchs who at some point were close to Putin and the Kremlin. Whether they are now or not, that changes quite regularly. But some of them, one of them is Vladimir Yakunin, another one is Konstantin Malefeyev, both oligarchs, very wealthy, and they have their own foundations which support different religious initiatives, Orthodox religious initiatives, but also citizens' initiatives. Both of those organizations are, to a greater or lesser extent, involved in funding different anti-choice activities. One of them, Vladimir Yakunin, had a project called the Sanctity of Motherhood, which basically tries to dissuade women from having abortion is a program that operates in several Russian cities, and they also tried to open this up in Serbia it was about a year ago or so.
Maybe just okay. First, sorry, just take a mic.
Thank you. Just to go back to the Vatican and to the Holy See, you've been talking about it as an institution, but would the man who's heading that institution nowadays, by the attitudes he's been having, make a difference, or has he made any difference? Pope Francis has been meeting agnostics, has been defending to some extent single mothers and meeting them, has released last year in September, if my memory is good, an order concerning the right to take the communion for divorced couples, which has been a big taboo and completely forbidden in the Catholic Church until now, and is, to my knowledge, in the latest centuries, the most open-minded Pope that the Catholic Church has had. So what impact has that had, or could that have, in these points that you've been very fairly pointing out, namely the family and the choices? Thank
you. Yes, you can answer.
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. Pope Francis has given a softer, more charismatic image to the Holy See than his predecessor. However, the substance of the policies on sexual and reproductive health and rights remains unchanged, and so and it will remain unchanged because that is the position of the Holy See and of the Catholic Church on these issues. They had an opportunity to discuss these issues back in the 1960s and 70s under the Second Vatican Council, and that established the position of the Church on contraception, abortion, etc. I'm not a Catholic, but as far as I know, it's not within the Pope's power to change that position, so the content remains the same. And in terms of the diplomacy of the Holy See, as it is deployed in different settings, that too has remained unchanged. So that if one takes a look now under Pope Francis at what does the Holy See mission in New York do and say at the United Nations compared to when it was under Pope Benedict or going all the way back, one finds that remains unchanged.
If I may just add, how do you comment then on the resistance in Vatican? For example, American Cardinal Raymond Burke, he was here in Zagreb last autumn. He's strongly against this Pope. Why is that? And does it have to do with these issues, or it's something else?
Yeah. I'll comment on that, but first I want to really emphasize I am not Catholic. Okay, so I don't know that much about Catholic teachings, but I can say that just to recall what I said earlier, there is diversity within the Catholic Church hierarchy. It's not a monolithic infrastructure, so that individual cardinals and bishops do have autonomy. And that within this diversity, there are different currents pushing the Vatican, pushing the Pope in different ways. There are some progressive currents, there are some very reactionary currents. And right now, the Pope seems to be one of the more progressive currents, progressive for that church hierarchy, not necessarily progressive on
general terms.
Exactly. And so probably the more reactionary currents are finding themselves it's like in any hierarchical structure. If your leader is from a current that you don't belong to, you're sort of out of favor. Mm-hmm. And so you react against that.
We had another question there.
Hello, hi. Thank you for your talk today. As Madam already asked the question, and didn't hear you answer it. How do you comment on the UN recently electing Saudi Arabia to the Women's Rights Commission? It's funny because the ultra-right movements are generally they're populist and anti-diplomacy and anti-UN and EU, and it seems like this center to liberal stream has nowhere to go, where, you know, diplomacy seems to be anti-women too, with what they did just recently by electing Saudi Arabia. Do you have a comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I just saw news of that myself recently. So I don't know the details of that, but I mean, it's not the first time that Saudi Arabia gets elected to a human rights position. And that is simply the reality of the geopolitics at the United Nations, where for these types of positions, states are regrouped into regional factions. Each regional faction is entitled X number of seats on a certain council or committee, etc. And then within that regional faction, they elect among themselves which country will be that regional faction's representative. So things like this happen, and it's a reality of the geopolitics at the United Nations.
There's
hello.
another one.
Okay. It's been years since these neo-conservative interest groups have been growing in power, obviously. That's a lot of time, and I imagine different liberal interest groups have been developing and implementing strategies to address this. Can you mention a few, which work, which don't? Thank you.
You want to have another question and then to answer? Maybe it's better if you can answer it then.
So successful strategies to counter the neoconservatives is basically what you're asking. Yeah. So successful strategies, that's a very good question. I'm just thinking right now, yes, there have been a certain number of them. One type of successful strategy that I found is simply exposing these groups for what they are. Very often they appear at national level. National level actors think that what's happening to them is unique, and that it has never happened before, and very often there's the wrong reflexes that set in because no one is proud of these things happening in your own country. So there's a reluctance to inform different people outside your country. Whereas in fact, if that were to happen, then one would be able to see the similarities of this thing happening in Croatia, similar to what was happening in Poland or Slovakia or France, etc. So there's been sometimes that's posed a challenge. What has worked very well is, one, connecting the dots between what's happening across the different European countries, and then also exposing this to media and politicians. I'll give an example of what we did. A couple of years ago, there was a European-wide citizens initiative called One of Us, which was aiming to stop funding to maternal health, because maternal health in part includes abortion. So no EU funding should be involved in that. And it was designed all around the protection of the human embryo. And so it was well worded. We knew that this was coming up. They had reached the requisite number of signatures, and once that happens in Brussels, you reach 1 million signatures, you automatically get a hearing in the parliament, a meeting with this commissioner and that commissioner, and you're able to present your case. What we had done is, in advance, we had prepared a dossier, and we had prepared all the media and the politicians. This is what this One of Us Citizens Initiative is all about. These are the organizations behind it, and this is what they actually mean. Behind this nice wording, this X, Y, and Z will happen. And as a result of that, all of the mainstream press coverage was unanimously negative about the Citizens Initiative. The only positive press coverage they could generate was in their own religious media. And then also all the main politicians from all the political parties either took a position against the initiative, or for some political parties it was difficult, so they simply remained quiet and were silently happy when the initiative failed.
Maybe we should, if I may just add, and then I'll take a question. Maybe we missed the opportunity to really clear what's the difference between traditional European conservative parties and because they are saying we are Demo-Christian, it's normal for us to have these values. That's what we are hearing from our government. But is it, the same? What they are standing for, these organizations, and European traditional conservative parties like this in EPP group, let's say, in European Parliament. What is the difference, and is this difference clear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The EPP group is interesting. It's the largest political family in the European region, the European People's Party, and it's present in just about every country. And on this issue is singularly divided. So that there are some EPP groups which are very conservative. And, for example, the EPP groups from Poland, Italy are very, very much conservative. Hungary, yes, are very conservative and draw inspiration from their own interpretation of Christian values, which is very reactionary. There's equally a certain number of other EPP groups, also Christian Democrats, who have a different interpretation of this and who are able to be, to varying degrees, supportive or distant, or supportive either actively or passively for sexual reproductive health and rights, and even abortion and equal marriage. Some examples include the Belgian Christian Democrats. The Flemish Christian Democrats will stand up for the right to abortion and equal marriage. In fact, in Belgium, we have equal marriage since 2002, I think, so a long time. One of the first organizations to support equal marriage were the young Flemish Christian Democrats, because they thought we're in favor of marriage for everyone, so more marriage is better. That was their initial point of view. Same thing with the French EPP group has traditionally been very supportive, but to be very honest, it's a divided group as a whole at a European level. But this division means that also it is not correct to say that because they're EPP, this is their position. They can have another position, and it is equally EPP.
Which part is stronger? This progressive part of EPP? I mean, speaking in numbers, let's say, in the European Parliament.
Yeah. When we take a look at the European Parliament, let's see, the EPP group would be, as I said, is the largest. Among the solid ones, which we count as progressive conservatives, it is usually France, which is one of the bigger EPP groups. All of the Benelux countries, so the three, so Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, but those are middle to small countries. And then there's the Scandinavian ones, the Nordic ones, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And then, depending on the specific issue, we can count a certain number of Germans also to be supportive, a certain number of Portuguese and Romanians to be supportive. So I would say they're perhaps 40%. So the majority is more conservative. But among the more conservative groups, we have to also understand the diversity there. Among the really, really conservative, that is less than 10% of even the EPP, and the rest are followers of the very conservative ones.
We had a question there.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your talk. In order to explain a little bit where my question is coming from, I'd like to outline a trend that I noticed with the liberal movement, which is essentially that the liberals tend to be open-minded for everything, unless the things that are contradicting the liberal movement. So we're open to LGBT communities, we're open to abortion, but we're not open to hearing people who have different views than we have, because I put myself in that group. So how do we rephrase the liberal movement in a way that it still holds onto the values of respecting everyone's beliefs, even if those beliefs contradict some of the things that the liberals tend to fight for. And then kind of leading onto that, how do we balance between fighting for the things that we believe in while still remaining true to cultural relativism and just respecting other cultures, which especially in this region tend to be related to someone's religion, and having in mind how, well, maybe not Croatia, but Western nations in general have destroyed cultures in the past. So how do we balance between fighting what we believe is right while still allowing for the coexistence with the things that we disagree with, which tend to be related to religions?
Try.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very complex philosophical question that you've just asked. So, I'll just share my own personal thoughts on the issue. I think one thing is that we need to be clear about our principles. As for me, I'm in favor of human rights, and I believe that human rights belong to everyone, regardless of what culture they happen to be born in, or what language they speak, or what country they happen to be in. And so I think that, that clarity of what are human rights has to be there. Also, just about all of the rights that we're talking about, especially in sexual and reproductive rights, they are in fact liberties for people. So that if you're in favor that a woman has a right to abortion, she does not need to exercise that right. It's a freedom that's given to her. If one is in favor of equal rights for LGBT people, even LGBT people don't need to practice this, don't need to get married, but it's a right that is open to them if they wish to have it. So I think that's the grounding that I'm in. That people may disagree with that is one thing. There's freedom of speech, but at the same time, we have to realize that what we're talking about simply expands the scope of horizon for different people and does not limit it.
Dražen?
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you could comment on a phenomenon that I think we've established by now is pretty clear, and that is the fact that within the neo-conservative movement in European countries, there seem to be two strands of thought regarding the market, economic freedom, and the role of the state in economy. Since from our Croatian experience, there seems to be this current that adheres to the idea of social policy, social justice, solidarity on the one hand, combining it, of course, with these conservative values on LGBT rights, abortion, etc. While on the other hand, there's also a current that is very staunchly pro-market, anti-interventionist, and anti-social solidarity, which is something that's rather foreign to our context. Thank you.
Yes, no, you're absolutely correct. It's the anti-choice, the neo-conservative movement is also diverse. It's not monolithic, and there's different organizations, different currents of thinking within that landscape as well. One of them is, which has been the predominant one in Europe now, has been very much Catholic-inspired, and it has been in favor of basically of the social welfare role of the state. There's been differences on certain aspects, contraception, abortion, LGBT, but basically it's essentially democratic and also supportive of the state. But something new has started to emerge in Europe, and that is one, as you've described, which is economically very, very libertarian, reactionary, which does not really believe in the role of the state to legislate or regulate economic behavior. And this is something which has been, it's a new incursion into Europe. It's more well developed in North America and Latin America. And but this is something that that's appearing now, and I would imagine what I've seen is that it's appearing more in the east of the European continent. It's you know better whether it's taking place here or not, but in a certain number of East European countries that has that has made a significant dent, not yet so in West European countries, even where anti-choice and neo-conservative movements are strong.
If I may follow up, you are talking about ultra-conservatives from traditional family property, I guess. They are pretty unknown here in Croatia, and if you can elaborate a bit their origin, and why do you think they are more present in East Europe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thank you about that. So tradition, family, and property, I think that's something I would not be surprised if almost none of you have heard about this. It is a religious and social movement that started in Brazil in the 1960s. And it then, from there, spread to other countries in Latin America and also to Europe. And it's a very peculiar religious movement. And by religious movement, it's similar to, I mean, I'm sure you all know other ones, Opus Dei, Legionnaires of Christ, Communion and Liberation, these types of ones. There's a Brazilian version, which is Tradition, Family, and Property. It's an interesting movement in that they believe in very libertarian approach towards market regulation. They really don't believe that the state has much of a role there. They believe in protecting the interests of the very wealthy, and specifically aristocrats. They've written a book called The Nobility and Analogous Traditional Elites. They believe in what they call the counter-revolution, in that the current ills of society now, as we face them, are the result of 3 previous revolutions. So the Protestant Reformation of the 17th century or 16th century, the French Revolution, which brought in the dangerous notions of equality, fraternity, and liberty. And then also the Communist Revolution of 1917. Added to this would be the Feminist Revolution of the 1960s, which has dangerously liberated women by offering them contraception and abortion. So it's a religious movement spread throughout Latin America, European countries. It takes a certain specific shape, and that it's not always easy to recognize. Within the Catholic world, it's among the what are described as ultra strict, so that even Opus Dei is only described as strict to moderate. Tradition, family, and property would be described as ultra strict. They take different faces in that in some countries you will find organizations called Tradition, Family, and Property. They exist in France, Austria, Germany, Italy. And they have satellite organizations, so that these satellite organizations, one type is often dedicated to preserving Christian culture or renewing culture of some sort. So that in France it's called Avenir de la Culture, in the future of culture. In Ireland it's called Young Irish for the preservation of Christian civilization, etc. And so you have these in a certain number of countries. Here it's called the Center for the Renewal of Culture. In a number of other countries, they have a dedicated anti-abortion organization, usually called something Right to be Born, droit de naître in France, Kinder in Gefahr in Germany. And they've developed also a new type of organization, Ordo Iuris, which specializes in litigation and legal advocacy. You can tell that they're all part of the same network in that they use the same imagery of a certain lion in a certain position, which was the logo of the founder of the organization way back in the 1960s. It makes use of medieval imagery and wants a return of nobles to power. And also in terms of leadership, what you'll find is that it's usually the same group of gentlemen, very often of a Latin American origin, who are on the boards of all the different organizations. So you take organization A, and the president of that organization will be the board member of organization B, the treasurer of organization C, and it's like that. And it's like this within a country. And then they exchange places also across countries, so that if we take a look here specifically, some of the board members or those involved in the TFP organizations here in Croatia come from Poland. In Poland, they're affiliated with Ordo Iuris, which is also affiliated with other tradition, family, and property organizations in Poland, and then from there to Estonia, to Canada, and so you can recreate the whole network that way of essentially men who are running these different organizations. So that's a little bit on tradition, family, and property. But I leave you to Google it yourself. It's one of the most colorful anti-choice groups that exists, and you deserve the pleasure of discovering that yourself.
Yeah, and we have some, Zaklada Vigilare is having that lion symbol, and they are cooperating with Ordo Iuris that we saw on Tradfest last autumn. Is there any other?
If may I use the opportunity that I'm holding a mic, so just to ask the Neil question. How do you see the relation between those ultra-conservative fundamentalist groups with neo-Nazi groups? Because sometimes it seems to me that they want to make a distance, because they're smart. They know if they will get connected with neo-Nazis, they will be discredited. So how do you see neo-Nazis are embracing or not embracing those groups? And do you have any information about the funding, for example, of TFP? Because we see a lot of very posh seminars organized in some expensive places. Any idea about the money?
Yeah. Okay, well, first in terms of posh seminars, remember TFP is in favor of the return of the nobility to power. So they will not do cheap-looking things. You know, they have nice houses wherever they own a nice house in Brussels from where they have a representation to the European Parliament. They're registered there as Fédération Pro Europa Cristiana. They're there on the EP Transparency Register, and they have Paul, the Duke of Oldenburg, a German noble, as their representative. So they have nice things. In terms of their money, from the accounts that I've seen of their French headquarters, they seem to have money, and it looks like they generated themselves through fundraising. So TFP, one thing that they've excelled at is fundraising from grassroots, where they make appeals for donations, but they also sell the books of the founder, Plinio Correia de Oliveira. They sell his works, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, The Nobility, etc. They also sell a miraculous medal, a little pendant that... so they make money that way. So it looks like they're largely self-financing. In terms of proximity with neo-Nazi groups, I don't like to use the word neo-Nazi because that evokes a certain type of fascism, which is very well known, and that's not necessarily the type of authoritarianism or fascism that they're striving for. What we see is a certain number of anti-choice groups, the TFP-related ones are the best example, have a certain degree of proximity with other very proto-fascist, quasi-fascist groups, which then have connections with other movements. So that, for example, in certain countries, monarchist movements, in France and in Italy, they're not nice things. You know, they don't collect plates with Princess Diana on the cover. These are monarchist movements, really are quasi-fascist movements in a certain number of countries. And we see a certain number of these organizations do joint seminars, for example, such as this, with monarchist movements. We see this with, for example, Alleanza Cattolica, which is one of the TFP organizations in Italy, having done conferences jointly with Fiamma Tricolore. That means the tricolor flame, that's the descendant of the Mussolini movement, and also the monarchist alliance. We see something similar in France with the TFP organizations associated with, openly in conferences, events, with Alliance Catholique, which is a monarchist movement. So we see that. perhaps a better example of the type of what they would be willing to associate is not so much Nazi, but more authoritarianism and fascism, such as that which existed in Spain under Franco, or Latin America in the 1970s and 80s up until the 90s. I think that's a better example.
Alina.
I just wonder where the money is coming from. Where the money is coming from for those organizations. I would be much obliged. If you might know something particular about Croatia, I would be even much more obliged.
Okay. In terms of the money, one thing just about all of the anti-choice neo-conservative groups will say is that they get money from different individual donations from people. Okay. From what I've been able to see, this does look to be largely true to a certain extent. And so they do benefit from private donations, 5-10 euros from different people. So that's one thing. But then there is also a donor landscape that the different anti-choice organizations can appeal to for support. And while it's difficult to know which of the potential donors funds which group, we know that they have been approached by different anti-choice groups, neoconservative groups, and so we can assume that they're part of that funding landscape. Such as if I were to make a proposal to the Gates Foundation or to Soros, you can assume that those foundations are supporting this type of work. So who's supporting this type of work? Well, we've seen that, for example, Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, a billionaire based in Mexico, has been approached a number of times to fund different anti-choice initiatives. And there's articles in Spanish media that show how he supports the anti-abortion movement. So that's Carlos Slim. Another source of funding is the US Christian right. So they do their own fundraising in the United States and then from that grant onwards into different parts of Europe, so that we know that there's the IRS, that's the Internal Revenue Service, the taxation service of the United States. You have to declare, where you spend your money. We know that Alliance Defending Freedom in the United States spends money on Alliance Defending Freedom, their offices here in Europe, in Bratislava and in Brussels. Same with the American Center for Law and Justice, supporting financially the European Center for Law and Justice in Strasbourg. So U.S. Christian right funding is another source. Another source that we've seen is Russian oligarchs. They have money. They spend money on different things, mainly in Russia, but also they've been appealed to support different initiatives around the world. And as I've mentioned, this group functions transnationally, so they do have different convening spaces where they meet. One of them is the World Congress of Families, and so they're like any NGO setting. You bring donors, the NGOs go fundraise with the donors, and that's what happens there. Other sources of funding, we've seen that the foundation set up by the Qatar royal family has also been funding different types of things. And also in France, there's a foundation called the Fondation Jérôme Lejeune, based around a French scientist, has been funding at least homophobic, socially conservative issues in France and also around Europe. And then to that also, one has to add what are called high net worth individuals, so that we know that, for example, different organizations in Spain and in the US approach wealthy individuals to support them for large cash gifts. So from what none of the funding for the anti-choice is very murky. We don't have a clear picture of it because there's none of it which is public. So there's less of an obligation to be transparent. But what we've been able to reconstruct from different places suggests that this is at least part of the infrastructure. One funny example in terms of funding for the anti-choice has been sometimes that money comes into a foundation which itself is anti-choice, and they provide funding towards anti-choice initiatives, but the money originally comes from other sources. One example is an Italian one the Fondazione Novatere, which funded different anti-choice initiatives around Europe, the money that they were getting was essentially corruption money from the government of Azerbaijan, because the founder of that foundation was a member of parliament in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and sold his votes for friendly votes on human rights issues when it concerned Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan put money in there. It's estimated between 2 and 3 million euros went into that foundation, and during the same time period, that foundation then was active on anti-choice neo-conservative issues. So it could be that funding comes from for non-SRHR, for issues completely unrelated, but then is spent on that.
Hello, great speech, and it's always great to hear you. And I happen to be from Poland, and I wanted to go back to Ordo Iuris because it's very strong in Poland and it comes over here. I'm sorry about that. And I also happen to do some part of my activism here in Croatia, and I'm also a human rights lawyer. So I'm totally with you on that. Human rights are the greatest value for me as well. And I wanted to ask about some strategies, because what I am, as a lawyer, personally, human rights lawyer, struggling with is the fact that the human rights agenda is taken away from us in a way, because that's what Ordo Iuris does. Because for years we've been told that human rights language does not work, that it's too hard for people, that we have to really make it easier. And once we kind of believed in that, it was used against us by such groups, by lawyers who use the human rights agenda against us because of the great manipulation that is done. But actually, it's like kind of taking some parts of it and doing a great manipulation around that to actually use it against human rights values. And by that, I know, just to give you an example, is of course around the right to life and just one sentence from the preamble of the Convention on the Rights of a Child, and building the whole agenda about the right to life on that, which is actually not valid, but it is still done. And you mentioned about freedom of religion and beliefs, and freedom of speech, and of course taking the notion of dignity to the level that is actually kind of manipulated. So I have a feeling that is actually what's going on. It's building the alternative human rights agenda around their values, and it's done by human rights language, and kind of in a way telling people that it is the actual human rights agenda. So reinterpreting the whole system and the whole outcome of the international human rights system to use it actually against it. And it's been going on for quite some time in Poland, and it's actually coming here because they actually, it was back in November, right? There was a conference, and Ordo Iuris members from Poland came to Zagreb, and it's going on. And you mentioned that it is really active, and I just was wondering whether, because it's really, of course, we know what human rights are and the values that we share and protect. I think we can agree on that, but it's, in a way, it's dangerous because, it's those who know the system can really know where the manipulation is being done, but I would say that the general public opinion, societies, whoever, is really hard to actually see what's true and what's manipulation. And I was wondering whether you had any strategies as a human rights and freedoms activist to try to I don't know, to do something more, because the human rights agenda is not enough, because right now it's it's in a way challenged by this manipulation around it. And Odakle seems to be doing a great job, and it can succeed unless we find a good strategy against that. And I was wondering whether you had anything in mind. Thank you.
And also, if I may add, Ordo Iuris is part of governmental working group for Istanbul Convention ratification here in Croatia. Yeah. Although they are not registered, or maybe they... Two months ago, they were not registered in Croatia. They were direct... They are not. They are just, you know, a branch of Poland's Ordo Iuris here in Croatia.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a very good question. There's two levels that I want to address that question. One, in terms of human rights language, and you've really expressed it very well. They are developing an alt human rights framework. That alternative framework really is only, we need to recognize it for what it is. I'm not familiar with the writings of Ordo Iuris itself, since I don't read Polish, but I have seen, I have read the writings of other groups similar to this, among them Alliance Defending Freedom and the European Center for Law and Justice. What I've noticed with their writings is that they use the language and the style of legal writing. And it may look convincing to someone who is not a lawyer, but you scratch beneath the surface and you realize this does not make sense. This is simply, I don't know, this simply looks like legal speak, but it isn't. It's not properly legally based. What's the expression? It's one of these Potemkin villages of legal speak. Well, I think there, I'm not too sure if it's the right approach, because I can fully understand that it's not a rewarding task to do, but to actually have lawyers sit down and deconstruct the gibberish that's being presented as proper legal briefs. And I can fully understand if you're a lawyer and this is not a grateful task to be doing, it's beneath you to have to do this, but maybe that's something that needs to be considered. Separately, in terms of this alternative human rights framework that's being developed, we need to combine this also with the fact that there's different news media that are being created, which can communicate these, so that people then are stuck in their own little tunnels where they simply hear self-reinforcing messages. What the answer to that is, I'm afraid I don't know, because I think we're all going through this together, and there hasn't yet been a successful strategy for how to overcome that. But I think at least now discussing it together, we can commonly assess that this is a challenge and test out different things to see about how to overcome that challenge.
Marina.
If you could share with us a little bit of your battlefield experience from the European Parliament, and what does it look like in the practice of policy making? What are some recent tactics and counter-tactics? And maybe if you can bring it closer home, maybe mention some specific groupings and actors or specific pieces of legislation where you could see, where you could really notice this kind of force and the agenda of the ultra-conservatives. Yeah. It is very important for us because it is obvious that Croatia is getting every day more and more integrated in the European policy realm, especially in this kind of conservative continent of policy making.
Yeah. Maybe I can provide two examples. One, an easy one, and then separately a more complex one. In terms of the easy one, what we've seen was that a certain MEP, one of the leaders of the anti-choice, Madam Anna Záborská from Slovakia, as well as some others, would introduce a specific amendment in the European Parliament as it was going through its reading of the EU budget. This amendment would have was aimed to stop funding towards organizations working on sexual reproductive health and rights. She presented this amendment every year for 4 or 5 years, and every time we were able to explain what this amendment was, and then it was defeated. This amendment, in fact, was a carbon copy of a similar amendment passed in the US House of Congress back in the 1980s, which established limitations on funding for reproductive health. But here's a case where a very clear example, something developed in the US was exported to Europe. It was attempted to be implemented in Europe. We were able to undo it. So that's one example. A separate example is more subtle, and that's how the anti-choice neoconservatives have been using the issue of religious freedom to advance their own agenda. And specifically, what they've been doing is talking about they've been talking about the persecution of Christians around the world. So according to them, Christians are the most persecuted people in the world, and they cite examples of what's been happening in Iraq, Syria. A couple of years ago, if you remember, there were bombings of churches in Nigeria, the Copts in Egypt, and things like that. So there's actual, real, life and death persecution of Christians that's happening. So from that basis, they established the framework of persecution against Christians and those real life and death situations. And then they add to this different instances which they say is persecution and intolerance and discrimination against Christians. So that, for example, not being allowed to exercise conscientious objection in reproductive health is intolerance and discrimination against Christians. And a whole range of other issues. When France passed the equal marriage law, that mayors would not be able to exercise their conscientious objection was seen as an intolerance and discrimination against Christians. So there's that they've been able to establish. What we've seen very concretely in the European Parliament is that they were able to convince a number of MEPs to discuss persecution and intolerance against Christians by citing some examples of what's been happening in the Middle East. From there, they inserted a wording in a resolution of the European Parliament asking that the Commission create a position of special envoy on discrimination and intolerance against Christians outside the European Union. For some reason, the Commission actually decided to take this up. The European Parliament says a lot of things and the Commission doesn't listen to all of it. But they took this up, and on a visit of the 3 heads of the institutions to the Vatican in 2016, 15 or 16, so there we have Martin Schulz, Donald Tusk, and I forget the third one. But they're there with Pope Francis, and there they announced the creation of a new position, which is that of special envoy. This special envoy, they appoint him, and it is Mr. Jan Fiegel, a former Slovak member of the European Commission, former Slovak minister and Slovak politician with the Christian Democratic Party. He's now in this new position. And he is someone who's very closely affiliated with One of Us, that initiative that I mentioned wants to stop funding for reproductive health issues. He's the head or involved very closely with the pro-life movement in Slovakia. So here we have, using that framework of persecution of Christians, then to get their own person inside the European Commission, and he answers, this will be interesting here, he answers to Commissioner Mimica. He's in Commissioner Mimica's team.
Mimica.
Yeah. Mimica, I'm sorry.
And he has a mandate of 1 year. Do you think that it's due somewhere in May? Do you think he will be re-elected?
That's very unknown, because the process by which he was even selected is untransparent. Mm-hmm. So it's
they obviously built some advocacy infrastructure, but what would you say? Are they strong enough to influence obviously they are in a way, because of what you said about this young figure, but do we have any examples where they actually changed the policy of Council of Europe or some judgment of European Courts of Human Rights, because they have all these legal, so-called legal arguments and all these institutes? Mm-hmm. What is their strength?
Yeah. Okay, so if we take a look at what is their strengths and what are their ambitions at different levels. First, in the European Parliament and also in the Council of Europe, they have not been able to pass through very much. So we did an analysis of our own voting patterns in the European Parliament. The progressive pro-SRHR sides, according to what we've been seeing, we win 97% of the time. So we've been able to block them, but it takes an increasing amount of effort to block the anti-choice, the neo-conservatives. What they have been able to do in the Council of Europe is to create a situation of fatigue by mainstream politicians, so that when they see this issue of women's rights, a number of other politicians just think, oh, not again, another fight. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that they have been able to do. So that's in legislative settings. In the council, where states, where governments mm-hmm. act, we've seen that they have been able to block EU consensus on certain issues. Where unanimity is required, it simply requires one country to stick it out and then to block that. And so we've seen that in a certain number of cases. Most recently in the UN Commission on Status of Women and the UN Commission on Population Development that took place respectively in April and March of this year, Poland, Hungary posed difficult issues, and we heard that Croatia was joining them in this group. So that's at the level of governments. Then at the level of courts, they have not been able to really make any headway at the level of courts, but they have ambitions. One ambition that they have is around the issue of conscientious objection. So there's a lawsuit that started in Sweden, where Sweden does not allow conscientious objection for obstetricians, gynecologists, and midwives in the issue of abortion, thinking that if you choose to become an obstetrician or a midwife, it's part of your job to be familiar and eventually have to do abortion. So so that's a Swedish law. They found a midwife who claims she wasn't able to get a job because she would refuse to be involved in abortion, and took the matter to court. So there's Swedish actors and then also Alliance Defending Freedom, their European offices. They took it all the way through the ombudsman, different labor tribunals, courts in Sweden. They've lost all the way through. That was their intention, because they want to take this issue to the European Court of Human Rights, and they want the courts there in order to take a stand on this issue. I think that I'm quite certain that they will lose at that level of the courts as well, but they gain in prestige in simply being able to argue something at that level, and that they were taken seriously so far. So we see that they're able to, that's their level of ambitions.
Yeah. They are actually trying to move things forward to really abandon the secular state. Our ministry, our vice president of government, Davorivo Stier, said the other day that what Croatia is and want to be is a liberal democracy, but at the same time he is advocating for religious freedom in public space. So the next step would probably be abandonment of a secular state. Do you think it's possible to have liberal democracy and not to have secular state?
Yes. First, I think we need to be, one thought that comes to mind is that religious freedom is a good value, and we're all in favor of that. What we have to be careful of is how it's been hijacked to, in fact, advance a very notion which goes against religious freedom. So we have to go back to the real nature of religious freedom. The way that the neo-conservative anti-choice interpret religious freedom does pose challenges for the exercise of liberal democracy. And that's quite clear. And it is undermining the nature of the secular state, and a secular state can take very many different forms. But what they're advocating for is a challenge to that.
Marina.
I'm sorry, but this is a short question. Maybe to give us some hope, maybe if you can, maybe you can share maybe some of your impressions and experiences regarding the surge and activism on part of progressive faith-based groups. I mean, as you said, the Catholic Church is not monolithic, and the religious faith-based communities around Europe are not monolithic. So have you had examples of maybe new alliances or cross-alliances between faith-based and human rights-based, how to say, groups, or some... This is one thing, and a second thing is, have you seen some effective strategies of kind of trying to contain this attack on secular state, because this is an attack on the concept of secular state, I mean, by some political parties, or what you see as constructive strategies?
One strategy that we've come to realize was first a realization of our own weakness. The progressive communities over the past several decades have been working in their own separate silos, independently of each other. So on the one hand, there was the women's group, which was slightly separate from the SRHR group, which was different from the LGBT group, which was separate from the humanists, and which was different from the faith-based progressive people. And we all did our own thing, and that was fine. And myself working in SRHR, when the LGBT groups made an advance, very happy, but it wasn't my thing. And same with them. There's been the realization now over the past 3-4 years that, in fact, our destinies are tied together, and that we need to be cooperating much more, both in order to progress, but also simply to maintain the advances that we've made. There's been, as I've mentioned at the very start, there's been an increased sophistication and professionalism of the anti-choice, which requires more efforts on the side of the progressives in order to mount a resistance to that. And this requires resources and different types of human and intellectual resources. And so we collaborate in this manner now at the level of Brussels. Among the EU coordination, there is a structure called High Ground, where ourselves and then the different communities that I mentioned are collaborating, and we do this with a long-term perspective of bringing our different movements closer together, and then also we do this at a tactical level where we collaborate very specifically on voting alerts, on information sharing, and etc.
I found one of your articles 4 years ago. You stated that true mission of these anti-choice groups is simply not acceptable to mainstream Europeans today. Do you still think the same?
I would say so, yes. I think what the anti-choice, what the neo-conservatives have been able to do is a very sophisticated rebranding exercise. And with that, they've been able to put on new clothes, look modern and new, and put on a nice face and professional face. But basically, what they're looking for is very much what they have always been looking for, which is, it results in ordinary citizens having fewer human rights than previously. And I think once we're able to understand this, explain this to the general public and the politician, once media also is clued up to this, because it's a very complex issue, and getting media and journalists to be able to spend the time simply to understand this, to then be able to communicate it in a manner which the general public can read, can understand, is itself complex. But once we're able to do that homework, then hopefully, then ideally, these neo-conservative anti-choice groups will be seen for what they are.
So if there is no other question, I would like to conclude with this, hopefully, ideally, nice thoughts in the end. Thank you very much for coming.